Mr. Majewski's Anatomy 32 class lecture, chapter 17, Spinal Cord. So here's an image of a spinal cord with nerves coming off of it. So the spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae of our back, and this vertebral column provides support to it. So here you can see sort of the spinal cord with the surrounding tissues and the vertebrae. The spinal cord is protected by three protective tissue layers, and they encircle the spinal cord and the nerves within the vertebral column. And this is up to the intervertebral foramen, to the holes where the spinal cord nerves come out. So first you have the epidural space. This is between the Dura Mater and the vertebral canal wall, and this is usually filled with connective tissue and adipose tissue. Then you have the most superficial layer of meninges, which is the Dura Mater, and this is made of thick connective tissue, and it is continuous with the brain's Dura Mater, as well as the outer covering of the spinal and cranial nerves. So here's the Dura Mater on the most outside. Next, going deeper, you have a space referred to as the subdural space, sub below the Dura Mater, and this contains interstitial fluid, just regular fluid around cells. And deep to that is the arachnoid mater, which is the middle layer. It's made of a thin layer of connective tissue, and again it's continuous with the brain's arachnoid mater. And then deep to that we have the subarachnoid space, and this is what is filled with shock-absorbing cerebral spinal fluid. Then deep to that is the pia mater, which is a thin, you can see it up here, thin, transparent layer of connective tissue, and this actually adheres directly to the spinal cord. And it is vascularized, so it's also what's carrying blood vessels to nourish the spinal cord. And then there are these little connective tissue outcroppings, which are basically thickened layers of the pia mater, and they help suspend the spinal cord in the middle of the dural sheath. So here again, you've got the spinal cord. Lying on it is the pia mater. Up above that is the arachnoid mater, which is in this picture fused to the Dura Mater. So if you look at the spinal cord as a whole, you see that it has a few interesting external features. To start with, it is roughly oval in shape. It is not a circle, it is an oval. And it extends from the medulla oblongata at the base of the brain all the way down to the second lumbar vertebra. So that's important to point out. It doesn't go all the way down to the sacrum. It stops at the second lumbar vertebra. It has two enlargements, the cervical enlargement around the neck area and the lumbar enlargement near the, sort of the lower end of the thoracic area. You also see at the very end of the spinal cord what's called the conus medullaris, which is a tapering sort of conical structure. Off of that continues roots of the lower spinal nerves. So the cauda equina here, thought of as the horsetail, are lots of really thin nerves that are continuing down to then come out and innervate different parts of the lower portion of the body. And then finally, the very end of the spinal structure is the filum terminal, which at this point, at the coccyx, the meninges fuse together and ankle the spinal cord so that it is kept approximately in the correct space within the vertebral column. So if you take a cross-section of the spinal cord, you see that it has what's sort of referred to as an H structure, or maybe a butterfly, and this is composed of gray matter. And then all the area around it is surrounded by white matter. It has two fissures, or sulci, or whatever. You have the anterior median fissure, this big space here, and then the posterior median sulcus, which isn't as wide, it's a little more narrow on the posterior side. Then you have some names for all the different little portions of the spinal cord. You have the gray commissure, which is the H's crossbar. You have the central canal. There's a little hole there, which is filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and that runs the entire length of the spinal cord. You have the white commissure, which is in front of the gray commissure, and it ends up connecting the two sides of the white matter in front. You have within the gray matter, you have the posterior gray horn, the lateral gray horn, and the anterior gray horn. The anterior gray horn contains somatic motor nuclei. The posterior gray horn contains cell bodies and axons of interneurons and axons of sensory neurons. And then the lateral gray horns contain the autonomic motor nuclei. Then you have the anterior white column, right and left, the lateral white column, and the posterior white column. And these are bundles of axons and that have a common origin or destination. And they can either be going up, aka they're taking a signal up to the brain, or going down, aka sending signals down to whatever relevant part of the body to cause an effect. So basically, the white matter is propagating sensory impulses from receptors to the brain, ascending, going up, and also carrying motor impulses from the brain to the effectors, or descending, or going down. Well, again, so they're acting like wires. They're carrying the signal. While the gray matter, on the other hand, is receiving and integrating the incoming and outgoing information. So it's acting more like the computer hard drive. Some disorders associated with spinal cords. Well, you can have spinal cord injuries, which can be caused by all kinds of traumas. And exactly what it's called depends on what kind of paralysis it leads to. So monoplegia is the paralysis of only one limb. Paraplegia is the paralysis of both lower limbs. Hemiplegia is the paralysis of an upper limb, part of the trunk, and lower limb on one side of the body. Quadriplegia is paralysis of all four limbs. And then if you look at the injury of the spinal cord, if it's a complete transection, that means the spinal cord was cut completely through, versus a hemisection, which means it was only cut partially. So now let's take a closer look at those spinal nerves. Well, spinal nerves are associated with the spinal cord. Obviously, they originate from it, and they consist of parallel bundles of axons and neuroglia that are wrapped in connective tissue. So this should look familiar because this is sort of like how muscles are arranged. So you got three layers of connective tissue. You have the epineurium, which is around the entire nerve. You have the perineurium, which is around individual fascicles, which are bundles of axons. And then you have the endoneurium, which is around an individual axon and its associated glial cells. And here's just an electronic micrographic image of this. So here's a fascicle, and you can see the blood vessels, and it looks pretty cool. All right, so the organization of the spinal nerves. Well, when they first leave or go into the spinal cord, they are called rootlets. So they're like these tiny little threads coming off of the spinal cord. The anterior rootlets are axons of motor neurons, so they're sending signals to cause something to happen, while the posterior rootlets are basically for sensory neurons, so they're bringing a signal into the spinal cord. So basically the way it goes is the anterior rootlets end up becoming a root. They converge together, and that goes on to be part of a nerve. While the posterior rootlets also fuse into roots that then form what's called the posterior root ganglion. So this is a swelling that contains the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. And note it's outside of the spinal cord. That's why it's a ganglion. And then eventually you get the spinal trunk or spinal nerve trunk, which is convergence of posterior and anterior roots that then quickly start splitting off into to go to the different regions they need to go to in what are called rami. So those things that branch off of that spinal trunk include the posterior ramus, which serves the deep muscles and skin of the posterior surface of the trunk, so basically our back. The anterior ramus, which is the thickest of them all. This serves the limbs and muscles and skin of the lateral and anterior surface of the trunk, so it's providing innervation for the bulk of the body. You have the meningeal branch, which re-enters the vertebral canal, so it just goes right back in order to provide innervation for the vertebral canal itself and associated structures. And then the rami communicantes, which are part of the autonomic nervous system, and we'll be talking about those a lot more in chapter 19, I think. But basically, they're going to another structure to then get sent to the proper parts of the body. So here's just another picture of that, but using a real spinal cord. You see the anterior rootlets, the posterior rootlets, how they're sort of coming together as roots and then fusing to form the trunk. That thing gets branched off of to form those ramis, or ramus. All right, plexus. What's a plexus? A plexus is networks of axons that are formed by the joining of various axons from the anterior rami of adjacent nerves. So basically, they are just these branching, interweaved structures. They include ganglia, autonomic, and somatic neurons, basically to make sure they end up going in the right direction to the right part of the body. So here, for instance, you have the nerves that end up coming off of that plexus. So you end up with an ulnar nerve, a median nerve, an axillary nerve. So basically, down at the legs, you get the femoral nerve and the sciatic nerve. So basically, you're going to end up with nerves that are carrying the axons to the correct portions of the body that they are innervating. Now, the anterior rami of the spinal nerves, T2 through T12, so most of them, do not form plexuses. And these are known as intercostal or thoracic nerves, so they just go right to where they're going. But you know what, since they're innervating basically just the abdominal wall, it's not too surprising that they don't have to form a complex structure. Dermatomes. Dermatomes are areas of the skin that provide sensory input to the central nervous system via one pair of spinal nerves. So basically, this portion of the arm, for instance, is innervated by C5, by the cervical spinal nerve 5. And by knowing where each of these dermatomes are in terms of their associated nerve, then you can know where there might be damage to the spinal cord. So if the doctor touches an area and you say, I don't feel that, then he knows, in this case up here, that it's C5. It's the spinal nerve cervical 5 that might be damaged, leading to that numbness. So it's worth to point out that you have areas for the ascending sensory tracts for signals going up to the brain, and then you have areas that are specific for the descending motor tracts. However, you don't need to know all their individual names. All right, we're going back to the simplest reflex arc. Again, we talked about this in the first, in chapter 16, and that is the simplest. Involves only 2 neurons, although it could be 3, but the simplest has 2. So you have the sensory receptor, which in the simple version can be the sensory neuron itself. You have the sensory neuron sending its signal to the spinal cord. Here's the posterior ganglion entering through the posterior rootlets and the posterior gray horn, and then that's going to synapse with the cell bodies of the motor neurons in the anterior gray horn. These motor neurons then signal out to the effector. In this case, it would be the skeletal muscle of our leg. In this case, we would kick our leg. So again, the most simplest form of a reflex arc consists of a sensory neuron, a motor neuron, and its effector. And that's it for chapter 17.